Welcome back. I was going through this story when one detail stopped me cold. She received the offer letter, tucked it into her bag, and said absolutely nothing. Not to her mother, not to her stepfather, not to anyone. For 3 years. The silence was not a wound, it was a weapon. You are watching Eternal Diary. The smell of the city at 9:47 on a Friday night is a particular kind of honest. Exhaust from idling buses, the faint chemical sweetness of a fast food fryer 2 blocks over, and underneath all of it, the damp concrete smell of a sidewalk that has absorbed 20 summers of rain. Mara Lynn stood at the glass entrance of 88 Harlow Tower and breathed all of it in. Her right arm ached from holding her briefcase for the past 2 hours. The foyer security guard had long since stopped looking at her with curiosity and started looking at her with the particular kind of pity reserved for people who have been waiting so long they have become part of the furniture. She checked her phone again. No messages, no missed calls, no running late, sorry, nothing. The group chat that her mother, her stepfather Chen Dewey, Sauce and her stepsister Vivian all shared with her, the one ironically named Family First, showed a cascade of messages from 3 hours ago about a dinner reservation at a place called Solace. She had been tagged in none of them. The restaurant booking confirmation that pinged at 7:04 p.m. had been sent to everyone except her. Whether that was an oversight or a statement, she had stopped trying to decide. It had been her stepfather's assistant, a kind woman named Polianne who always smelled of white tea, who had been designated to pick her up. Polianne had called at 6:55 to say the car was downstairs. Mara had told her to give her 3 minutes to finish packing her desk. When she came downstairs at 6:59, the car was gone. She had stood on the same spot she now occupied and called back. The call rang out. Then again, then a curt text from Polianne. Mr. Chen said to take a cab. He will reimburse. He never did. She knew that already. This was her last day at Chen Dui's company. Not the internship she had wanted, the one at Hartwell and Sato on the 44th floor, but the one her stepfather had arranged for her at his own real estate development group on the 19th floor. A favor, he had called it. She had spent 12 weeks making copies, reformatting presentation decks, and being introduced to visiting clients as my wife's daughter, not as Mara, not as his stepdaughter. I'll see my wife's daughter. Possessive of the woman, nothing of her. She had applied to Hartwell and Sato anyway, in secret. During her lunch breaks, she had revised her cover letter in the Notes app on her phone, finger-typing each revision because she was afraid of using the office computers. She had printed her resume at a FedEx on the corner of Clementi and 6th. She had attended the firm's campus information session alone, Asu wearing her good coat, the one she had bought herself from 6 months of tutoring high schoolers in contract law principles, and she had sat in the second row and asked 2 questions that made the partner presenting look up from his slides and really, genuinely look at her. The offer had come 4 days before the end of the internship. Sent with a formal letter in a cream-colored envelope bearing the Hartwell and Sato crest. 2 interlocking H's in deep navy delivered to the address she had listed on her application, which was her university dormitory, not the family home in Green Hill Terrace, where she still spent her weekends. She had read it 3 times. Then she had folded it precisely, placed it inside the zippered interior pocket of her briefcase, and told no one. She hailed a cab at 10:03 p.m. She sat in the back seat and watched the city's lights drag across the window in long, wet streaks, and she thought about what she was going to do next. She thought about it all the way home. Then she climbed the stairs of the Green Hill Terrace house, past the living room where her mother and Chen Dewey were watching television with Vivian between them, paused long enough to say goodnight, in a voice so unremarkable that none of them looked up from the screen, and went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed. She took the offer letter out of her briefcase. She read it one more time. Then she opened her laptop and accepted the position. She set the start date for 3 weeks out. She told no one. That had been her first life. In her first life, the silence lasted 2 weeks before her mother, Wei Hongmei, noticed that Mara was spending her evenings in her room, engaged in what looked like concentrated preparation. Reading, making notes in her legal pads, updating contacts in her phone. Her mother knocked on the door and asked, with the casual suspicion of a woman who was not curious so much as territorial, what Mara was doing. And Mara, who had always been constitutionally bad at lying to her mother, had told her. Not everything, not the offer letter, not the salary, not the name of the firm, just, "I'm starting a new job soon." Her mother had paused in the doorway. Then she had called downstairs to Chen Due. So what followed was not the shouting kind of confrontation. Chen Due was not a man who shouted. He was a man who sat very still and spoke in the even, measured cadences of a person who had been in boardrooms long enough to know that stillness is more threatening than volume. He had sat across from Mara at the kitchen table and explained to her, in the manner of someone reading an instruction manual, that the arrangement had always been that Mara would work at his company after university. That he had held a junior associate position for her, that he had turned down 2 other candidates for that position specifically to accommodate her, that her decision to go behind everyone's backs reflected poorly not just on her character, but on her mother's ability to raise a child with appropriate gratitude and loyalty. Her mother had said nothing during this. She had stood near the kitchen counter and turned her wedding ring in small rotations and said nothing. Vivian, from the doorway, had watched with the specific quality of attention of someone who is carefully memorizing a performance for later reference. Mara had started at Hartwell and Sato 3 weeks later. She had told herself it was enough, that she had the job, that the rest would follow. She threw herself into the work with the total commitment of someone who has identified a single life raft in an otherwise empty ocean. She was good at the work, better than good. She had an instinct for contract language, for the tiny structural vulnerabilities in corporate agreements that other first years either didn't notice or noticed too late. Her supervising partner, a meticulous man named Elliot Hartwell Jr., whose suits were always exactly the right degree of expensive, had called her into his office 6 months in and told her she was doing well. She had nearly cried in the elevator on the way back to her desk. She had pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and breathed through it until the feeling passed. But the family had never been at peace with what she had done. Chen Due's method of expressing displeasure was architectural. He restructured the household economy in small, precise ways. Mara's monthly allowance, which she had not asked for but which had been a quiet feature of the household since her mother's remarriage, was discontinued. The car that had sometimes been made available to her on weekends was no longer available. When the family went on holiday, which happened twice a year, she received the information about dates and departure times approximately 12 hours before departure, making it logistically impossible to join them. And then, when she did not join them, her absence was described to relatives and family friends as her being too focused on her career to make time for family, framed with the specific warmth of people performing sadness while feeling relief. None of it had broken her, but it had worn her down in the manner of water on stone. Not dramatically, not at once, but consistently, invisibly, across years. In her first life, she spent 7 years at Hartwell and Sato. She made senior associate. She was the youngest person in the firm's 40-year history to be named to the shortlist for partnership consideration. She had a small apartment in the Beeston district with south-facing windows and a kitchen that smelled of cast iron and garlic. She had 3 close colleagues she could trust. She had the work. She did not, in her first life, ever tell Chen Due about any of her professional accomplishments. Not from strategy. Simply because the connections between them had corroded to the point where they no longer existed in any functional sense. Her mother called on Sunday evenings and asked about her health and the weather and whether she was eating enough protein. They did not discuss Mara's work. They did not discuss Mara's life. They discussed the weather. The partnership consideration was ultimately given to someone else. A man named Francis Gao, 3 years Mara's senior, whose client billings were lower than hers, whose case win rate was lower than hers, whose peer reviews were consistently less positive than hers. When she asked Elliot Hartwell Jr. for an explanation, he had given her one, in the measured cadences of a man who had clearly anticipated the conversation and prepared for it. He had said, "You're outstanding, Mara. The clients love you. The issue is integration. And yet the senior partners need to feel a sense of connectivity with whoever holds this position, and Francis has been building those relationships for a long time." She had understood the translation. Francis Gao played golf. He attended the right dinners. He laughed at the right jokes. He had the right kind of easy, unremarkable social manner that allows a room full of powerful men to forget he is there, and then to trust him completely precisely because they have forgotten he is there. And Mara had not built those relationships. She had spent 7 years building case files instead. She had resigned 2 months later. She had been approached by a boutique corporate law firm, Naipaul Stern and Associates, and she had taken the offer. She had spent the following 4 years there, quietly building a client roster in restructuring and M&A advisory that was small but deeply loyal. And then Chen Dui's company had filed for regulatory review. The details of this had been public record. Chen Dui's real estate development group, CDW Holdings, a firm that had grown significantly over the preceding decade through a combination of genuine commercial acumen and access to government-adjacent development contracts that Mara had always suspected were obtained through methods that would not survive forensic accounting scrutiny, had been selected for a financial audit by the regulatory body after a whistleblower complaint from a former mid-level executive. The audit had taken 18 months. The findings had been extensive. Mara had followed the proceedings from a distance in her first life. She had read the regulatory filings with the professional detachment of a lawyer who is technically uninvolved and the personal detachment of a woman who has spent enough years processing her own history that the story no longer had the power to hurt her acutely. Our CDW Holdings had been required to divest 3 of its major commercial property holdings at a government-mandated valuation that was, by independent assessment, approximately 30% below market rate. Chen Dui had paid a significant fine and had been banned from serving as director of a listed company for 5 years. Her mother had called her during this period, not on a Sunday evening, on a Tuesday afternoon. She had said, in a voice that was smaller and older than the voice Mara was accustomed to hearing, that things were difficult, that Dui was stressed, that Vivian had been offered a position at a firm in Hong Kong and might be relocating. She had not asked Mara for anything specific. She had not needed to. The ask had lived in the architecture of the call, in the pauses, in the careful way she described the difficulty without ever naming what kind of help she wanted. As if she were holding an empty cup toward Mara and waiting for Mara to fill it herself. Mara had not offered anything. She had said she was sorry to hear things were hard. She had asked whether her mother was personally well. Her mother had said she was fine. They had ended the call with an agreement to speak again on Sunday. They had spoken on Sunday. They had discussed the weather. 3 years later, Mara had collapsed in her office at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday. Cardiac event. She was 34 years old, and she had been working 90-hour weeks for 8 months on a restructuring case, and she had not eaten a real meal in 4 days, and she had ignored 3 separate instances of chest pressure that she had told herself were stress and caffeine. She had woken up in a hospital bed. Her mother had flown in. Chen Dui had not come. Vivian had sent a flower arrangement with a card that read, "Get well. I'm thinking of you," in handwriting that suggested it had been written by a florist. Her mother had sat beside the hospital bed and held her hand and cried quietly. And Mara, who had been staring at the ceiling of a hospital room and taking the first inventory of her life that she had allowed herself in years, had felt something very cold and very clear settle in the middle of her chest. Not grief, not anger, something more precise than either. Like she had thought, I have spent my entire life winning the wrong game. She did not recover fully. The cardiac damage was manageable, but permanent. She had modified her work schedule and spent the next 2 years winding down her practice, handing off clients, tying loose ends. She had died on a gray February morning, at 36, alone in her apartment in Beeston with the south-facing windows and the cast-iron pan she had never replaced. Not from her heart, from a complication. And the kind of thing that sounds clean in an obituary and is not clean at all when you are experiencing it. When the window light is coming in at a low angle and you are thinking about all the moves you did not make. She was thinking specifically about the regulatory case against CDW Holdings. She was thinking about everything she had known and everything she had failed to use. She opened her eyes in her university dormitory room. The smell was different. Instant noodles and laundry detergent and the specific dry paper smell of legal textbooks stacked too close together. The ceiling had a water stain in the shape of a country she had never been able to identify. She had been staring at that water stain for 3 years. She knew exactly what it looked like. She was 22 years old. She sat up in bed. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum. Her heart was steady, both lungs full. No pressure. She breathed out slowly through her nose, a long, controlled exhalation, and listened to the sound of her own breathing and felt the sheer, overwhelming strangeness of having a fully functional body and also every memory she had ever accumulated. She sat on the edge of her bed for a very long time. Then she got up and went to her desk and opened her laptop, and she began to plan. The planning had a different quality in this second life. In the first life, she had planned from a position of uncertainty, always calibrating, always adjusting, always building models based on incomplete information and watching them partially fail. Now she planned from a position of totality. She knew the terrain. She knew the weather patterns of every relationship she would encounter. She knew the professional landscape of every institution she would engage with. She knew the exact fault lines running beneath CDW Holdings, their depth, their geometry, the precise timeline on which they would become catastrophic. She had spent 11 years in her first life accumulating this knowledge. She now had it at 22, intact, accessible, waiting to be applied with the clean precision of a surgical instrument that has never been used. She pulled up her application materials for Hartwell and Sato. She had already applied in this iteration of her life, just as she had in the first. She had attended the campus information session. When she had sat in the second row, she had asked her questions. The application had gone in 3 weeks ago. The difference was that she now understood what she was applying to with a completeness she had not possessed the first time. She knew Elliot Hartwell Jr.'s preference for candidates who demonstrated commercial awareness rather than pure academic achievement. She knew that the second partner on the interview panel, a woman named Dr. Constance Sato, the founding partner's daughter, who handled M&A and had opinions about everything, was specifically looking for candidates who could demonstrate pattern recognition in contract analysis. Not just technical recall. She knew the case study they would present in the final interview round. Not because she had cheated or researched it improperly, but because she had, in her first life, heard Elliot Hartwell mention in passing at a firm event that the case study scenarios hadn't been updated in 6 years. She had filed the comment away without knowing why. Now she knew why. She revised her cover letter. Not dramatically. She was careful not to overcorrect. Not to produce something so polished it read as artificial, but with the specific calibrated adjustments of someone who knows which locks the key needs to fit. She replaced one paragraph with language that demonstrated awareness of recent corporate restructuring cases in the jurisdiction. She added 2 sentences about her interest in the commercial real estate sector, not because she was performing interest, but because she genuinely had it now, shaped by a decade of watching CDW Holdings and understanding what was possible in that sector for someone who knew its geography. She submitted the revised application at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Then she opened a new document and began a different kind of work. This document she titled simply CDW, not as a strategy, not yet, no, just as a record. She was methodical about records. She had learned their value the hard way, in boardrooms and courtrooms and late-night revision sessions, where the absence of a properly maintained paper trail had cost cases that should have been won. She began with what she knew from memory, and she wrote it in clean, factual paragraphs, each one footnoted with the category of information it represented: public record, personal observation, professional inference. And she was careful about the distinctions. The 3 categories had different weights, different admissibility, different utility. She wrote for 4 hours and then she stopped because she was 22 and her body still needed sleep in a way that her 34-year-old body had largely ceased to require. She slept for 6 hours. She woke up and ran 3 kilometers in the campus park in the gray early morning. And she noticed with the specific attention of someone returning to a place after a long absence that the oak tree at the park's east entrance had a large branch she had always looked at, and the branch was intact. Whole, precisely as she remembered it from 10 years ago before the storm that had taken it down. She stopped and looked at it for a long moment. Then she ran back to her dormitory, showered, made tea, and sat down to continue her work. The interview call came 2 weeks later. She had expected it. The interview itself, which took place in a glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor of 88 Harlow Tower, not yet the 44th floor, she was only a candidate, the 44th floor would come later, proceeded along the lines she had anticipated. The case study was the one she had prepared for. She answered it with the comfortable assurance of someone who has considered the material at depth, which she had, although the depth was 11 years rather than the 2 weeks since the call. She was careful not to be too smooth. She made one deliberate error of emphasis, caught it herself, corrected it, and watched Dr. Constance Sato's eyes sharpen with approval. People trusted candidates who could identify and correct their own errors more than they trusted candidates who appeared not to make any. The offer letter arrived on a Wednesday, 4 days before the end of the internship she was completing. Not at CDW Holdings offices, not in this life, because she had refused it when Chen Dewey offered it. She had declined politely and had instead arranged a short internship at a small commercial property consultancy for the academic credit, which gave her proximity to the sector she needed to understand while maintaining a distance from Chen Dewey's company that she intended to keep. Chen Dewey had been displeased by the refusal. He had expressed this at the Sunday dinner, where she had declined, in front of her mother and Vivian, using the measured boardroom tones that she now experienced not with fear or shrinkage, but with the clear-eyed recognition of a woman who has diagnosed a pattern. He had said, "I've arranged something very good for you, and you're throwing it back. That's not gratitude, Mara. That's arrogance." Her mother had made a small, tight sound and turned her attention to the food. Vivian had watched. Mara Hayes, but said, "I appreciate that you went to the trouble. I already had something arranged." She had kept her voice level, and she had continued eating her food. She had not explained further. She had not defended herself. Explanation was a form of asking for approval, and she had decided in the early planning hours of her second life that she was done asking Chen Dewey for approval of any kind. Chen Dewey had looked at her for a long moment, with the eyes of a man calibrating whether the resistance he was encountering was temporary or structural. Then he had said nothing more, which meant he had classed it as temporary. She noted this and filed it. The offer letter from Hartwell and Sato came in a cream-colored envelope. She opened it in her dormitory room as she had the first time. She read it 3 times as she had the first time. She folded it precisely and placed it in the interior zippered pocket of her briefcase. Then she accepted the position by email. She told no one, not out of the same passive protectiveness that had governed her first life. The silence in her first life had been the silence of someone who has been trained by incremental exposure to expect that any good thing she possessed would become a site of contest. The silence in this life was something else entirely. It was structural. It was intentional. It was the first move in a game she had already mapped to the final position. If they did not know she had the job, they could not position themselves around it. If they could not position themselves around it, they could not undermine it. If they could not undermine it, she could build inside it for as long as she needed without interference. She started at Hartwell and Sato on a Monday in early September. She walked through the glass entrance of 88 Harlow Tower at 8 in the morning. Ontod took the elevator to the 44th floor and stood for a moment in the lobby with its view of the city's skyline and felt something she did not have a precise name for. Not triumph. Closer to confirmation. The feeling a navigator has when the stars align with the chart. She went to her desk. She began to work. Before any of that, though, there was the first morning. The first Monday, the elevator doors had opened onto the 44th floor, and she had stepped out and been struck. The way you are sometimes struck by a place you knew once and are returning to, by the specific acoustics of it. The low hum of the air handling system, the particular way carpet absorbed footsteps, so the whole floor moved in a kind of muffled, concentrated quiet that was different from the silence of emptiness, and was instead the silence of concentrated effort. 43 people doing serious work in rooms divided by glass and partition. She had known this floor for 7 years in another life, and she stepped onto it now at 22 with the disorienting sensation of arriving somewhere simultaneously familiar and entirely new, the way a city looks different from the ground than it does from the map you have memorized. She had been shown to her desk by the firm administrator, a woman named Grace, who had the precise, unhurried manner of someone who has been orienting new associates for long enough that she can identify which ones will last by their posture on arrival. Mara had been shown her desk, her login credentials, her firm email, the location of the printer, the coffee machine protocol. The 44th floor had a serious coffee situation, proper beans, a machine that required actual calibration, which she had not remembered but which pleased her now. And then Grace had said, "No, Elliot will be by at 10, and left her to it. She had sat down. She had looked at her desk. It was a clean, blank space. The kind of professional emptiness that is also an invitation. She had opened her laptop and set up her profile and mapped her first week's workload and thought, here is where it begins properly. She was good at it in this life as she had been in the first. Oh, but the quality of her performance was different in a way that was difficult to articulate to anyone outside her own interior. In the first life, she had been excellent, and she had known she was excellent, but the knowing had been entangled with the need to prove it. To Elliot, to Constance Sato, to the senior partners, to the unnamed audience of people who had not believed in her. The performance had always had a degree of desperation to it. Oh, the faint breathlessness of someone sprinting toward a finish line they are not sure they are allowed to cross. In this life, there was no breathlessness. She had already sprinted this track once. She knew where the finish line was, and she knew she could cross it. The work was not a performance of competence, but the expression of it. Clean and uncontested in her own internal architecture, and that difference was visible to everyone who worked near her, even if they could not name it. Old Elliot Hartwell Jr., who had an extremely refined instrument for detecting the presence or absence of professional confidence, noticed it within the first month. He assigned her a more complex portfolio than was standard for first-year associates. She handled it without any visible adjustment in her effort or her composure. Constance Sato, who handled M&A, noticed it as well. Constance Sato was a woman of 62 who wore her hair in a precise silver chignon and communicated almost entirely through the angle of her attention. And when her attention was directed at you, the full 90 degrees of it, it was not comfortable. It was not uncomfortable in a hostile sense. It was more the feeling of being accurately appraised, which most people find considerably more exposing than being unfairly judged. She invited Mara to observe in an M&A advisory session in the third month. The session involved a mid-market acquisition, a regional logistics company purchasing a smaller competitor, and it had the particular dynamic of a straightforward transaction that had been made complicated by the target company's founders, who were brothers, and who had reached the negotiating table with 20 years of unprocessed sibling grievance and a combined total of 3 separate legal opinions that all said different things. The advisory session was a kind of triage. Constance Sato ran it with the contained efficiency of a surgeon who has encountered this particular anatomy before and knows where all the nerves are. Mara observed. She spoke when spoken to, which was twice. Then, at the conclusion, when the clients had left and the junior associates were gathering materials, she said, "The indemnification clause in the target's existing shareholder agreement has a carve-out that isn't reflected in the draft share purchase agreement. If that's not reconciled before exchange, the acquiring party's liability on the historical IP matters is uncapped." Constance Sato stopped gathering her materials. She looked at Mara with an expression that contained the specific quality of recognition that professional women sometimes direct toward younger professional women when they encounter something in them that they once had in themselves, and that the world did not make easy to keep. "Where did you study contract structure?" Constance Sato asked. "Independently?" Mara said. A pause. Then, "How independently?" "Extensively," Mara said. Constance Sato looked at her for another moment. Then she picked up the draft agreement and turned to the indemnification clause. She read it. She turned to the shareholder agreement. She read the carve-out. She set both documents down. "You're right," she said. It was not the kind of statement that had anything performative in it. It was purely factual and carried the full weight of being said by a woman who did not make a habit of saying it unless it was fully earned. The next Monday, she was formally assigned to shadow Constance Sato's M&A team for 1 day per week in addition to her standard portfolio. It was, Mara knew, the most significant professional relationship she would build in this iteration of her career. In her first life, she had built it too tentatively, always slightly deferential, in a way that Constance Sato respected but did not entirely trust. A mentor relationship required a certain quality of reciprocal respect. The mentor extending knowledge, the protégé demonstrating not just capacity, but a specific kind of intellectual confidence that told the mentor her investment was going somewhere. In this life, Mara brought Constance Sato that confidence without calculation. It was simply what she had. 12 years of professional formation compressed into a 22-year-old body that still had the stamina to work 14-hour days, which was, she sometimes thought, almost unfairly productive. But Constance Sato began inviting her to lunch on the last Thursday of each month. These lunches were not casual. They were working sessions in the guise of meals. At a Japanese restaurant 3 blocks from the office where Constance Sato had a standing reservation and where the owner never seated anyone else at the adjacent tables, which created a pocket of professional privacy. They discussed cases. They discussed sector trends. They discussed structural approaches to complex transactions. And Constance Sato also, occasionally, without framing it explicitly as mentorship, told stories about her early career, about the cases that had formed her, about the decisions she had made at crossroads that Mara was currently approaching. Mara listened to these stories with the full investment of someone who knows their value precisely, who has already experienced some of the crossroads in question and is receiving the older woman's navigation of them as both data and gift. One Thursday, over their respective bowls of soba, Constance Sato said, "You hold things very close. I've watched you for a year. You don't discuss your personal life. You don't discuss your family. You don't tell people things they don't need to know." She paused. "That is sometimes a strength and sometimes a limitation. Do you know which it is for you?" Mara thought about this honestly, which was what Constance Sato's questions always required. "Currently a strength," she said. For reasons specific to my situation." Constance Sato looked at her. "Your stepfather's company?" Mara's attention sharpened fractionally. "You know about that?" "I know what's knowable in professional circles about a mid-market development company with regulatory exposure," Constance Sato said. "I know your name. I know your mother's name. The connection is not difficult for someone paying attention." She paused. "Have you considered the appearance question? Yet if the matter becomes public and your association becomes known." "Yes," Mara said. "The transactions I'm involved in are at arm's length and properly conflicted out. The strategic clarity is documented." She paused. "I have been careful." "I know you have," Constance Sato said. "I'm asking whether you've been careful enough to survive the optics if someone decides to make them an issue." "Yes," Mara said. And she meant it. She had war-gamed the optics scenario extensively. She had built a paper trail of conflict disclosures and recusals and legitimate professional distance that could withstand scrutiny from any angle. She had not built it to survive scrutiny. She had built it because it was the right way to conduct herself, and the side effect of doing things correctly was that the paper trail existed. That was, she had found, the cleanest kind of protection. You did not have to remember what you had said because you had always said the truth. Constance Sato nodded. "Good." She returned to her soba. Then she said, "The partnership track decision cycle begins in 14 months. Elliot has been watching you. I have been watching you. You should know this." Mara said, "I know." Constance Sato looked up. The expression on her face was the closest thing to a smile that she reliably produced, which was a very slight adjustment of the lines around her eyes. "I thought you might." The work was absorbing, and she let it absorb her. Well, because absorption was protective cover, and also because she genuinely loved it. The forensic quality of corporate analysis, the particular satisfaction of finding the structural issue that everyone else had passed over, the way a well-constructed argument in contract law had the aesthetic quality of a perfectly balanced equation. She worked long hours, but not the self-punishing hours of her first life. She stopped at 8 p.m. on most evenings. She ate actual meals. She ran 4 times a week. She rebuilt the small habits of physical maintenance that she had, in her first life, systematically dismantled in the name of the work and that had, eventually, dismantled her instead. At home, which was still the family house in Green Hill Terrace, because she could not afford her own flat yet, she maintained the persona she had been maintaining for years. Mara the unexceptional, Mara the directionless, Mara who was figuring things out. This required a certain degree of performance. But when her mother asked about her days, she described them in generic terms. Work, paperwork, some research. When Chen Dewey asked at dinners he did not invite her to, but which she attended anyway, because her mother's face when she absented herself had a particular quality of fragile hope that Mara was not yet ready to withdraw from. When he asked, she said still getting settled. when Vivian asked, with the studied casualness of a woman who is actually conducting an audit. Aisushi said, "Nothing interesting." Vivian Chen had not in the second life done anything to Mara that was directly actionable. She was, by ordinary standards, a relatively unremarkable antagonist, not cruel in a dramatic sense, but consistently, precisely engaged in the small work of diminishment. She told stories about Mara's past failures in company. She forwarded articles about early career mistakes with the note, "Thought of you when I read this." She positioned herself in every family gathering as the daughter who was succeeding, which was itself a relational project that required Mara to be, by contrast, the daughter who was not. She did this not with malice exactly. Mara had spent years deciding whether it was malice, and had eventually concluded it was something more banal and more difficult to address. It was self-architecture. Vivian was building a self, and the foundation of that self required a certain kind of story about Mara. Mara let her build. Nama for now. The CDW document on her laptop had grown in the months since she had begun it into something substantial. It was organized into 3 sections. The first was historical, a timeline of CDW Holdings' corporate activity compiled from public filings, news records, and her own memory of information that had come to her through professional channels in her first life. The second was financial, a structural analysis of CDW Holdings' balance sheet as it currently stood, all drawn from public accounts, cross-referenced with her own professional assessment of what the numbers were concealing. The third was strategic. This was the section she spent the most time on. It was also the shortest. It contained, currently, exactly 4 lines. The lines read, "Whistleblower complaint filed by former CDW executive. First life timeline, approximately 22 months from now. Regulatory audit, 18 months duration. Outcome, forced divestment, significant penalty, a director ban. Key vulnerability, land acquisition contracts in the Felton Marsh development portfolio, executed under structures that misrepresented the identity of the contracting party to secure government-adjacent pricing. Entry point, the acquiring party in the forced divestment." That last line was the one she returned to most often. In her first life, the forced divestment had resulted in CDW Holdings selling 3 commercial property assets at 30% below market rate to a buyer who had positioned themselves perfectly for the moment, a private equity consortium with strong regulatory relationships and a track record of acquiring distressed assets in exactly this kind of enforcement-adjacent situation. She had never known, in her first life, who the consortium was. She had not been involved. She had watched from a distance. A private citizen with professional knowledge, she had no standing to deploy. Now she had standing. Or she would. She was building it. The strategy was not, she wanted to be precise about this, revenge. Or it was not only revenge. Revenge was too small a word for what she was doing, and also too emotional. What she was doing was the application of foreknowledge to a situation in which foreknowledge was a legitimate professional advantage. She was a corporate lawyer in the process of developing specialization in M&A and restructuring. CDW Holdings would, in approximately 2 years, be precisely the kind of case her developing specialization was designed to address. That her stepfather happened to own CDW Holdings was an additional element of the situation, not the animating one. Or that was what she told herself when she examined her own motivations carefully. But she was honest enough with herself to know the examination was not always clean. She was also building a second track that had nothing to do with CDW Holdings directly. This second track involved her biological father. Lin Jiyuan had died when Mara was 12. He had been a civil engineer who built bridges and had opinions about concrete and made very good soup dumplings on Sunday mornings, and had died of a fast-moving cancer without enough time to properly arrange his affairs. So he had left an estate that was, by Mara's childhood assessment, modest. The house they had lived in, a small amount of savings, some personal property. After his death, her mother had remarried Chen Dewey within 2 years, which was fast enough that certain relatives had made certain comments at the edges of family gatherings. Mara had not thought seriously about her father's estate until her 3rd year at Hartwell and Sato in her first life. to when she had been working late on an estate law matter for a client and had experienced a sudden, specific memory of a conversation she had overheard at age 11 before her father's illness had become visible between her father and his brother, her uncle Lin Feng, about a property her father jointly owned with a business partner in the old commercial district. A small building, 4 stories, commercial ground floor with residential above. Oh, she had remembered this conversation because of the specific phrase her father had used. The arrangement benefits us both while we're both here, but it needs to be documented properly when the time comes. The time had come. It had not been documented properly. Her father's interest in the property had, to the best of Mara's subsequent investigation in her first life, simply disappeared. There was no record of it in the estate proceedings, no record of a buyout, no record of transfer. Whilst the business partner, a man named Su Wei-han, continued to own the building outright. He had sold it 11 years after Lin Ji-won's death for a sum that would have been substantial even after equal division. Mara had discovered this, in her first life, too late, and with insufficient standing to do anything effective. She had been a private individual, investigating a matter that required formal legal process. Oh, and the statute of limitations on the original claim had been a subject of genuine ambiguity. She had consulted 2 senior colleagues and received inconclusive assessments. She had not pursued it, partly because of the limitation question, and partly because, by that point in her first life, she had been drowning in the Naipaul Stern workload and could not afford the additional burden. In this life, she had standing. In this life, she had time. In this life, she was inside a law firm with access to estate law expertise and a developing professional reputation that gave her the standing to ask questions that would be taken seriously. She began quietly to research. The research revealed that her father's business arrangement with Su Wei-han had been documented, partially. There were commercial property records showing the joint ownership structure at the time of the original acquisition. There was no subsequent record of dissolution or buyout in the statutory timeframe. The gap in the estate proceedings was not an ambiguity, but a concrete omission. Someone had allowed it to be an omission. She identified 3 possible causes: administrative failure by the estate executor, active concealment by Su Wei-han, or, and this was the possibility she spent the most time with, some arrangement made during or immediately after Lin Ji-won's illness. Before the documentation could be properly completed, that had been relied upon by the surviving parties without being legally formalized. The estate executor, she discovered, had been a man named Po Ching-wei, who had since retired and was currently residing in a coastal town approximately 3 hours from the city. He was 81 years old. He was still alive. She did not contact him immediately. She was methodical. She spent 8 months building the evidentiary record first, compiling every available public document, cross-referencing property records, constructing the timeline with the precision of someone who understands that a legal claim is only as strong as the paper it stands on. She used the land registry's electronic search system, which she had learned to navigate in her first life with the comfort of long familiarity. She pulled title records, transfer instruments, stamp duty filings, historic mortgages. She created a master timeline document that was 12 pages long and cross-referenced in 3 columns: the documented record, the known gap, and the inference that filled each gap. She was careful to keep the inference column clearly labeled. Inference was not evidence, but inference, properly labeled and honestly held, told you where to look for the evidence that would replace it. The financial forensics of it were, once laid out, stark. Means the building at the time of Lin Ji-won's death had been assessed for commercial property purposes at a value that was a matter of public record. The sum recorded as consideration in the transfer document was approximately 18% of that assessed value. 18%. In any M&A context she had ever encountered, a transfer at 18% of assessed value was either a gift, a fraud, or the product of a distressed sale executed under conditions that would not survive scrutiny. And none of those 3 possibilities was favorable to the Su Wei-han estate's current claim to clean title. She also built, separately, a financial model of the building's value trajectory from the year of the original transfer through to the present. This was relatively straightforward, using commercial property index data, comparable sales in the district, and the development activity in the surrounding blocks that she knew had driven values in the area. As the model showed a compounding appreciation that meant the current value of a 50% interest in the building was significantly greater than the nominal transfer price paid in the original instrument. The gap between those two figures, the nominal payment and the current value of the thing that payment was supposed to represent, was a number she put in the strategic section of her CDW document. But not because it was directly related to CDW, but because it reminded her of the principles she was working from. That the correct application of a financial forensic lens to improperly executed historical transactions reveals value that is invisible to everyone except the person willing to do the reconstruction. She did this work entirely on her own time, else using firm resources only where there was a legitimate professional basis for doing so, and being careful to keep the personal dimension clearly separate. She was inside a law firm. She understood the ethical geography. She did not cross lines. She walked exactly on the edge of them and not one step over. In the 14th month of her second life at Hartwell & Sato, two things happened in the same week. The first was that she was assigned, as junior counsel, to a mid-sized M&A transaction involving the acquisition of a private commercial property fund by a larger institutional investor. The target fund held a portfolio of assets that included, among many other things, a mixed-use commercial residential building in the old commercial district. She pulled the property records for the portfolio as a matter of standard due diligence. The building's address was on a street she knew. She had walked past it when she was 10 years old, walked on the way to her father's office, and he had pointed at it and said something she had been too young at the time to fully remember. She sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she pulled more records. The building was registered to the estate of Su Wei-han, who had died 4 years ago. His estate had transferred the asset to his children, who had formed a private fund vehicle to hold the family's property portfolio. The fund was the target of the acquisition she was currently working on. She pulled more records still. She cross-referenced, she built a subsidiary analysis document, and then she sat with it for several hours and thought with extraordinary care. The chain of title from the original joint acquisition to the current registered owner had one documentary gap. One gap. 14 months of title history during and immediately after Lin Jiuan's illness and death. In which the transition from joint ownership to sole ownership was recorded in a single transfer document, signed by the estate executor, Po Chung-wei, without any supporting commercial documentation showing the consideration paid, no buyout agreement, no declaration of dissolution of the joint venture, just a one-page transfer form. One-page transfer forms of this nature were not inherently improper, but they were, under the applicable estate law framework, challengeable if the consideration was not documented. And the consideration here was not documented. And the relevant limitation period she had researched carefully ran not from the date of death, but from the date of discovery of the impropriety, and was therefore not necessarily expired. She sat with this for a long time. The second thing that happened that week was that the whistleblower complaint against CDW Holdings was filed. She knew this because Chen Dewey called her mother on a Wednesday evening, and the call lasted 3 hours, and she could hear, from her room, the specific quality of silence that her mother produced when she was listening to something that required her to suppress a very strong reaction. When the call ended, her mother came upstairs and knocked on Mara's door and stood in the doorway with an expression Mara had not seen on her face before. Not the tight, controlled face she usually wore in relation to Chen Dewey's business difficulties, but something looser, more uncertain, as if the framework she usually imposed on information had temporarily failed. She said, "Dewey is having some difficulties at the company," Mara said. "I heard it's a regulatory matter." Her mother looked at her sharply. Where did you hear that?" "Professional circles," Mara said. "It was filed publicly." Her mother took this in. Then she said, "Is there anything that can be done?" Mara looked at her mother for a long moment. Her mother was 54 years old in this iteration of their lives. She was still beautiful, in the precise, somewhat guarded way she had always been beautiful. She had spent 32 years making choices that prioritized the stability over truth, and had arrived at an expression of permanent low-level anxiety as a result. She did not know what her daughter did for work. She did not know where her daughter worked. She knew Mara had a job at a firm, and had not asked further because asking further would have required engaging with the reality that she had missed 12 weeks of her daughter's professional transition and had, by the specific act of leaving her on a sidewalk in front of a building at 9:47 on a Friday evening, communicated her evaluation of what that transition was worth. "I'm not in a position to help with that kind of matter," Mara said. "You'd need a specialist in regulatory defense." She paused. "I can give you a referral if you need one." Her mother's expression shifted through several things. "That's all?" she said. "A referral?" "That's all I'm able to do," Mara said. Oh, she gave her mother the name of a competent but not particularly aggressive regulatory defense firm. The kind of firm that would file the appropriate responses, meet the appropriate deadlines, and ultimately fail to prevent the outcome that was coming because the underlying conduct was what it was. A good firm. Just not a firm that could produce miracles for a client with the kind of exposure CDW Holdings had. She closed her door and went back to her desk. The M&A transaction involving the Sue Han Estates property fund was complex and moved slowly, as large transactions do. Mara moved through her piece of it with the dual attention of a professional doing excellent work and a private individual collecting information for a separate purpose. She was careful, always, about which piece of her was doing which work. She consulted the firm's estate law specialist, a slightly pedantic man named Marcus Webb, who wore reading glasses on a chain and had an encyclopedic memory for statutory interpretation. On several hypothetical questions about joint venture dissolution in estate proceedings, framing them as general research for a client matter, Marcus Webb answered them with characteristic thoroughness and no apparent suspicion. She wrote to Po Chang-wee in the 22nd month of her second life. A letter, formal and precise, identifying herself by name and profession, and explaining that she was conducting research into an estate matter in which she had a personal interest as a descendant of one of the parties. She asked whether he would be willing to speak with her. He replied 10 days later by handwritten note. His handwriting was the careful, deliberate script of someone who had once been trained in formal correspondence and had maintained the habit. He said he was willing to meet. He noted that he had wondered, for some years, whether someone might write to him about this. She drove to the coastal town on a Saturday in March. The town was the kind of place that existed at a slight remove from ordinary time. Older buildings, slower pace, the particular quality of light you get near water in the early afternoon. The air smelled of salt and engine oil, and the cold metal smell of fishing gear. Po Chang-wee's house was a small bungalow with a garden that was aggressively well tended. Oh, the garden of someone who applied professional precision to domestic life after professional life had ended. Every plant was cut to the same height. The path was edged with the specific care of a ruler. He met her at the door with the wariness of an old man receiving a stranger, and then, when she introduced herself by her full name, with something more complex. "You look like him," he said. "Your father." She was prepared for this to be difficult. It was more difficult than she had prepared for. She sat in his front room with tea she did not drink, and he told her what she had partly already reconstructed from documents. His house smelled of camphor wood and old paper, and the particular sweetness of dried jasmine. There were photographs on the cabinet behind him. Photographs of people at different life stages. The record of a long life. Faces she did not know except for one. Her father, younger than she had ever seen him, in what appeared to be a professional photograph from the early years of his career, his expression carrying the contained, slightly formal pride of a man who is not accustomed to being photographed and is making an effort for the occasion. She looked at it while Po Chang-wee talked. She kept her face professional, and she looked at her father's young face, and she breathed carefully. Po Chang-wee said, "He trusted people, your father. It was not a weakness. It was how he was made. He believed that people who had shaken hands on something would honor it. He believed documentation was for strangers, not for people who knew each other." He paused. He turned his tea in his hands. "I told him once that he should formalize his arrangements better. He said, Fung and Wei Han are like brothers. I said, brothers have lawyers too." He paused again. He did not take the advice. "And when he was ill?" Mara said. "He was very ill very quickly. It went fast, his illness. He had been, not well, but managing. And then it was fast. He cleared his throat. The sound of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is aware of its weight, but has adapted to it. I visited him a month before the end. He was alert. He knew me. He said, "Po the building. Make sure the right things are done with the building." I spoke to Wei Han. I said I would see to it. Oh, I believed he meant that he had made an arrangement and I should honor it. He looked at his hands. I made an error. I should have verified. I was not a lawyer. I was a civil servant who had been trusted by a good man, and I was in grief myself, and I made an error in the nature of my trust. Mara said nothing for a moment. The camphor wood smell was very present. Outside, the garden was very still in the afternoon light. Did Wei Han tell you my father had agreed to sell? She said. He told me your father had agreed to a buyout at a price they had discussed. He had a figure. He said your father had wanted the family to have liquidity after his death, that it was your father's wish to give your mother a clean situation. He paused. I believed him. Your father did care about leaving things clean for your mother. That part rang true, and I was a civil servant in grief, and I executed the transfer. He lied to you, Mara said, not harshly. As a point of record. Would you, yes, Po Changyuadi said. He looked at her directly. He lied to me, and I allowed myself to be lied to because the truth required more of me than I had at the time. He was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry for it, for what it is worth at this remove. I am sorry. She looked at him. Then he was 81 years old, and he was sorry in the genuine way of someone who had been carrying a specific weight for 30 years and had adjusted his entire posture to compensate for it, and now it was being named, and the naming was a form of relief, even if it was also a form of exposure. She had not expected to feel sympathy for him. She felt it anyway. She was capable, she had found, and of holding multiple positions at once. The forensic clarity of what he had done wrong, and the human understanding of how he had ended up doing it. Both things could be true. She did not need to resolve them into a single judgment. I'll need a formal statement, she said, attesting to the circumstances as you've described them. My lawyer will prepare the form. I will give it, he said. Oh, I have been ready to give it for some time. She thanked him, and she stood, and she looked once more at the photograph of her father. Then she drove back to the city, 3 hours along roads that ran parallel to the coast, and then turned inland. And she thought about Lin Jiwan and his belief that documentation was for strangers, and how that single belief had cost him a building and cost her a decade of clarity about what she was owed and how she was now, at 22, using the machinery of documentation with the total precision of someone who has fully internalized the lesson. She also thought about Chen Due. Specifically, she thought about a dinner that had happened 11 months into her second life. A dinner she had attended at Green Hill Terrace, a Sunday, the kind of heavy weather Sunday at the end of winter when the light goes gray and brown and the house smells of cooking and central heating and the week's accumulated domestic weight. She had sat at the table and served herself and eaten with the unremarkable presence she had been maintaining, and Chen Due had looked at her across the table with the specific quality of attention of someone who has been reconsidering an evaluation. He had said, out of nowhere, or out of the particular nowhere, that was actually the nowhere of a man who had been sitting with a thought for several weeks and had decided to externalize it. You should think about coming to work at CDW. So now the junior associate position is still open. There's a lot of real estate activity in the next few years. Good time to be in the sector? She had looked at him. She had been eating a very ordinary dish of braised tofu that her mother made well, and she had been thinking about nothing in particular. And now she was looking at Chen Due, making this offer with the particular warmth of a man who believes his generosity is the most interesting thing in the room. And she said, I appreciate the thought. She said nothing more. He had pushed slightly. It would be a real opportunity. What you're doing now is fine, but you're not in a firm that's going anywhere in particular, are you? He didn't know she was at Hartwell and Sato. He thought she was somewhere small and directionless. She had carefully maintained this impression. CDW is growing. You'd have real exposure. I'm comfortable where I am, she said. Comfortable is not the same as growing, he said, with the tone of a man who believes he is offering wisdom. She looked at him for a moment that was slightly longer than the previous moments. In her first life, this kind of comment would have produced in her a complicated internal weather system, anger, then the suppression of anger, Then the exhausting work of deciding how much of the suppressed anger was justified and how much was her own insecurity. She had none of that now. And also what she had instead was a very clear view from a great height. Chen Dui was a man of considerable commercial competence and complete emotional opacity who had built a life on the premise that generosity extended from a position of power was the same as genuine investment in another person's well-being. He had never, in any interaction she could recall across 2 lifetimes, been interested in who she actually was. He had been interested in what she could be usefully positioned as. Oh, his wife's daughter, a potential CDW employee, a variable in his domestic and professional portfolio. She was not angry at him for this. She was simply absolutely done with it. "Thank you," she said. She picked up her fork. She continued eating. The subject had not come up again at that dinner. But 3 weeks later, in a different conversation, not at dinner, in the hallway, passing each other in the kind of accidental proximity that family houses produce, he had stopped and said, well, with the studied casualness of a man who is not casual, "Your mother tells me you turned down the position when I first offered it." A pause. Why? She had stopped too. The hallway was dim. The overhead light had been flickering for weeks, and no one had replaced the bulb. There was the smell of the dinner that had been cooked and cleared, the ghost of onions and something savory, and the particular staleness of an enclosed space that hasn't been aired that day. She and Chen Dui stood in this dim, slightly stale hallway, and she looked at him. "Because I had something better," she said. He looked at her with the eyes of a man recalibrating. "Better than what I was offering?" "Yes," she said. She did not say it unkindly. She did not say it with the electric charge of someone settling a score. She said it the way you say a fact. She held his gaze for a moment, then she said goodnight and went upstairs. She heard him standing in the hallway for a long time after she had gone. That interaction had clarified something she had been constructing at a theoretical level. She had wondered, in her planning, whether the quiet of her strategy, the absence of confrontation, the refusal to perform her success for the people who had expected her failure would feel like a half measure. Whether there would be a need at some point for something more direct. She had found, standing in that hallway, be watching Chen Dui recalibrate, that there was not. The direct confrontation was what people wanted. They wanted her to perform her injury and her triumph so they could engage with it, contextualize it, reduce it to a narrative they had a role in. The refusal to perform it was the actual conclusion. He could not engage with what she would not show him. He could only stand in the dim hallway and understand that somewhere in the distance between them, something had changed, and he had not been informed about it, and would not be. In the car, she thought about her mother signing that document. She thought about the period of her mother's life in which that had happened, the months after Lin Jiwan's death, before the remarriage, the period of financial uncertainty and grief, and the specific vulnerability of a woman with a 12-year-old daughter and a house she could not maintain alone, and a man who had appeared at precisely the moment when the architecture of her security had collapsed and offered to rebuild it. She did not want to think about her mother with contempt. She had spent her first life oscillating between contempt and grief for her mother, and had found neither useful. But what she wanted was to understand it clearly enough to act on it properly. The property was now held in the Suihan Estates Fund. The fund was in the process of being acquired. She was junior counsel on the acquisition. She had a conflict of interest, personal financial interest, or at minimum potential personal financial interest, in a target asset that she was obligated to disclose. She disclosed it the following Monday morning. She walked into Elliot Hartwell Jr.'s office and explained the situation with the precision of someone who has been composing the explanation for days. She said she had discovered, in the course of due diligence on the transaction, an asset that was potentially subject to a historical estate claim in which she had a personal interest as an heir of the original party. She said she was disclosing this at the earliest opportunity. She said she wished to step back from any aspect of due diligence related to that specific asset and requested guidance on how to handle the matter properly. Elliot Hartwell Jr. listened to this with the full attention of a man hearing something interesting. Then he said, "Do you have evidence to support the estate claim?" "I have a preliminary evidentiary basis," she said. "I would need formal legal representation to pursue it." "Marcus Webb," Elliot said. That would be appropriate, she said. Also, Marcus Webb took the case on a personal referral from Elliot. He reviewed the documents Mara provided, the property records, the transfer form, the timeline, the notes from her conversation with Po Chang-wee, whom she had subsequently obtained a formal statement from, and he put his reading glasses on and took them off twice. And then he said, "This is a strong challenge to an improperly executed transfer. The consideration question is clear. Oz, the question is your mother's capacity and whether her consent was appropriately informed at the time of signing." He paused. "Do you anticipate she will be cooperative?" "No," Mara said. "Not initially. Your stepfather's current situation may change her calculus," Marcus Webb said. She had already considered this. Chen Dui's regulatory difficulties were progressing along the timeline she had mapped in her document. The audit was ongoing. The preliminary findings, which had not yet been made public, but which were moving through the regulatory system, were as bad as she had known they would be. CDW Holdings' legal team was competent, but its position was not. The forced divestment was coming. The personal liability findings were coming. The director ban was coming. The financial penalty was coming. The comfortable architecture of life in Green Hill Terrace. The house, the cars, the dinners at restaurants with names that were also adjectives. Oh, the school fees for Vivian's continued postgraduate coursework that Mara had never been offered was coming to its end. Marcus Webb filed the preliminary notice of claim in the 41st month of Mara's second life, which was also the month in which the regulatory audit of CDW Holdings entered its final phase. Her mother called her 3 days after the notice was filed. She called on a Tuesday afternoon, not a Sunday evening. She said, "There's something filed against Due's company. Something about property." Her voice had the careful quality of someone testing whether ice will hold. Mara said, "I know." Her mother was quiet. "It's not about Due's company," Mara said. "It's about a property in the old commercial district, one that was jointly owned by Baba and Sue Han." The silence on the phone changed in quality. It became the silence of someone recognizing something they had successfully not thought about for a long time. "Mara," her mother said. And the single word had a shape that Mara had been waiting for her entire adult life, and that still, when it came, cost something to hear. The shape of someone who knows they have done something they cannot defend, and is trying to find out whether the person they have done it to is going to allow them to continue not defending it. "I need you to understand some things," Mara said. Her voice was even. Yeah, and she had practiced this conversation not as a performance, but as a preparation. The same way she prepared for difficult client conversations, by identifying the core facts and deciding in advance which points she would not yield on. "The claim is against the Sue Han Estates Fund, not against you personally. I am not pursuing a claim against you, but I need you to provide a statement attesting to the circumstances of the transfer document you signed. I have spoken to Po Chang-wee. Oh, and I have the document. I know the consideration paid. I need your statement." Her mother said, "What will happen if I don't?" "The claim proceeds on the evidentiary basis we already have," Mara said, "which is adequate. But your statement would resolve the question of your informed consent, which is the one element that's currently ambiguous." "And if I give it?" "The claim proceeds with a stronger basis and a cleaner timeline," Mara said. "And it is resolved faster. But for everyone." Her mother made a sound that was not quite a word. Then she said, "Does Due know about this?" "Not yet," Mara said. "Due has many other things on his mind at the moment." Another silence. Her mother said, "What kind of lawyer are you?" Mara looked at her reflection in the dark window of her office. She had been working late. The city below was a grid of lights. She had a view now. The 44th floor had a view. "The kind Baba would have been able to afford," she said. Her mother gave the statement. The claim against the Sue Han Estates Fund was resolved over the following 7 months through negotiated settlement. The settlement, which Marcus Webb handled with characteristically meticulous precision, established that the original transfer had been executed without adequate consideration and without appropriate documentation of the purported prior agreement between the parties. The Sue Han Estates Fund agreed, as part of the resolution, to pay the equivalent of half the building's value at the time of the original transfer, adjusted for a legal interest rate, to Lin Jiwan's estate, which, under the applicable succession framework, flowed to his sole surviving heir, The sum was transferred to an account in Mara Lin's name. It was more money than she had ever had. It was less money than Su Wei-han had actually benefited from the original transaction, when the eventual sale price was accounted for. Underneath the gap between those two numbers was the price of imperfect information and elapsed time. She accepted the settlement because a clean resolution was worth the gap. She had learned in her first life and in the accumulated years of this one that the perfect outcome was the enemy of the actual one. She deposited the settlement funds and did not mention them to anyone in Green Hill Terrace. The CDW Holdings regulatory findings were released in the 48th month. They were public, formal, also comprehensive. The regulatory body had found systematic misrepresentation in the Felton Marsh development portfolio contracts. Exactly the structural issues she had identified in her private analysis document, formatted now in the clean, dispassionate language of regulatory determination. CDW Holdings was required to divest 3 commercial property assets within 9 months at government-regulated valuations. Chen Dewey was personally assessed a financial penalty. He was prohibited from serving as director of any listed company for 5 years. The news was covered in the business press with the moderate interest accorded to mid-market enforcement matters that are significant to those involved and invisible to everyone else. Mara read the coverage on her phone over breakfast in her apartment. She had her own apartment now, in a building on the west side of the city, with large windows and a kitchen she had taken considerable care to properly equip. Well, so she read the coverage with the even attention she gave to professionally interesting case developments. She added the date to her records, then she made a call. The call was to an investment fund manager named Patricia Yuen, whom she had met at a professional event 18 months earlier, and with whom she had maintained a periodic professional relationship. Patricia Yuen managed a fund with a specific focus on acquiring distressed real estate assets in enforcement-adjacent situations. She was a technically brilliant operator, not flashy, not the kind of person who appeared in profiles, but consistently effective in a way that was visible only to those inside the relevant professional circles. Mara had worked hard over the preceding 2 years to become a person inside that circle. She said, "There are 3 commercial property assets coming to market under regulatory mandate within the next 9 months. Meant I have a full diligence package on 2 of them and a preliminary package on the 3rd. I think they are worth your attention." Patricia Yuen said, "Send me the packages." Mara sent them that afternoon. She had spent 6 months building them. They were among the most thorough preliminary diligence documents she had ever produced. They were thorough because she knew these assets. She had spent 4 years learning them, as building her knowledge from public records and professional analysis and memory. She knew their title histories, their encumbrances, their development potential, their regulatory exposure, their structural conditions. She knew what they would sell for under the mandated valuation. She knew what they were actually worth. Patricia Yuen came back to her within 72 hours. "I want to move on all 3, she said. "So who is your counterpart on the seller's side?" "The seller's legal team is in the process of being assembled," Mara said. "They were using CDW's internal legal team, which is compromised for this transaction. They'll need to bring in external counsel." "Is your firm able to handle the buy side?" Mara had already discussed this with Elliot Hartwell Jr. the previous week. She had presented the transaction in professional terms: significant commercial property acquisition, distressed seller, clean regulatory mandate, sophisticated buyer client. She had not mentioned Chen Dewey. She had not needed to. The conflict question was clean. She had no current representation relationship with CDW Holdings or any entity associated with them. She had verified this with the firm's conflict check process. She was clear. "Yes," she said. The transaction took 4 months to execute. It was complex. 3 simultaneous asset transfers under regulatory mandate required careful coordination with the enforcement body and the seller's external counsel, who turned out to be a mid-market firm handling the matter competently but without any particular insight into the asset's underlying value dynamics. Mara worked the transaction with the total focus of someone who knows the terrain in the dark. Patricia Yuen's fund acquired all 3 assets at the mandated valuation and closed the transaction cleanly. The day the transaction closed, Mara sat at her desk for a long time after everyone else had left. The office was quiet. The city below the 44th floor had reached the particular quality of evening where it was neither day nor night, but the space between them. That hour when the artificial lights and the last of the natural light achieve a temporary, uneasy equilibrium, and each one rendering the other slightly less certain. She had always found this hour the most clarifying. In her first life, she had often been the last one in the office and had experienced this hour as desolation, the evidence of what she had given up in order to be here. In this life, it was simply the hour when the noise fell away and the clarity increased, and she was grateful for it. And then she opened her CDW document and looked at the 4 strategic lines she had written in the first week of her second life. Whistleblower complaint, filed. Regulatory audit, completed. Key vulnerability, confirmed and resolved through regulatory determination. Entry point, executed. She sat with these lines for a long time. They were so brief for what they represented. She thought about everything that had fed into those 4 lines. The months of document construction, the forensic analysis, the careful relationship building with Patricia UN, the conflict disclosures, the painstaking attention to every ethical boundary along the way. She thought about Constance Sato's question at the soba restaurant. Do you know whether your silence is a strength or a limitation? She thought about the answer she had given, currently a strength. The truth was more complex than the answer. The silence had been both. It had been the structure inside which she had built everything without interference. And it had also been, at certain points in the process, sitting at Sunday dinners with a briefcase in her room and a law firm's name on her email signature that no one at the table knew. A kind of loneliness. Not the destructive kind, the productive kind. The kind that keeps you honest about what you are doing and why you are doing it. She closed the document. She sent it to her personal, secure archive. She made herself a coffee and stood at the window and looked at the city and let the particular stillness of a completed project settle around her. The settlement money from her father's estate was in an account under her name. The partnership offer was in her briefcase. The 3 commercial properties that had been CDW Holdings' most significant assets were now held by Patricia Ewan's fund at valuations that would, over the next 5 years, appreciate by the percentages Mara had modeled. But the forensic logic had been clean throughout. The paper trail was immaculate. She had built it that way from the beginning, not to survive scrutiny, but because that was how you built things that lasted. The wealth she had now, the settlement from her father's estate, the professional reputation she had built over 4 years that felt to everyone else like the natural speed of an exceptional career, was the advisory contribution to the Patricia UN transaction, whose fee was a number with more digits than she had previously associated with her own name, was not what it had been about. She was clear on this in the way that you are clear on the things you have examined from every angle and found consistent. What it had been about was the specific understanding, which she had spent 11 years in her first life trying and failing to process into something functional, that she had always been more than the evaluation assigned to her by the people who had failed to show up. She had not needed to tell them she had the job to prove this. She had needed to do the job. The job was done. There would be another one tomorrow. She was, it turned out, very good at the work, and the work did not end, and she was glad of that. She needed something to fill the hours with. She had always been better with the hours when they were full. She finished the coffee. She rinsed the cup. She picked up her briefcase. She took the elevator down 44 floors and walked through the glass entrance of 88 Harlow Tower and turned left on the pavement in the direction of home. And behind her, the building's lights were on. Floor after floor after floor, going all the way up. Chen Dewey called her mother in the week after the transaction closed. She knew this because her mother called her on a Sunday evening, which was the first Sunday call in 11 months, where her mother's voice had the quality of genuine uncertainty rather than performed wellness. She said, "Dewey says the assets were acquired by a fund that used your firm as counsel." She paused. "Is that correct?" "Yes," Mara said. Her mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He wants to know if you were involved." "I was lead associate on the transaction," Mara said. "It was a legitimate commercial acquisition at the regulated price. His counsel can review the documentation." She paused. "How are you doing?" Her mother made the small, tight sound. "I'm fine," she said. "I bought an apartment," Mara said. "It has a guest room. If you need space at any point, you know how to reach me." Her mother said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Since when do you have an apartment?" "A while," Mara said. I've been settled for some time, Elliot. Hartwell Jr. called her into his office 2 weeks after the transaction closed. After he sat across from her with the expression of a man who is composing something he has been thinking about for a while. He said, "The Ewan transaction was exceptional work. Patricia Ewan specifically mentioned your contribution in her post-close review." He paused. "I want to talk to you about the partnership track." She already knew what he was going to say. She had known since the beginning of this second life that this moment would come. The difference was that she now knew the pathway. Not just the technical one, but the relational one, the one that involved building the kind of connectivity that had been absent in her first life. She had spent 3 years building it with deliberate care, not by playing golf, by being someone whose judgment people trusted, whose discretion was reliable, whose professional presence made the people around her feel more capable rather than less. And she had learned this distinction too late in her first life. She had applied it from the first day of the second one. She sat in Elliot Hartwell Jr.'s office and she listened to what he had to say. The offer was formal and came with a letter, a cream-colored envelope bearing the Hartwell and Sayado crest. 2 interlocking H's in deep navy, the same crest that had appeared on her hiring offer 4 years ago. Oh, she noted this detail with the part of her that could not stop being an archivist of her own life. She read the letter twice, not 3 times. Twice was enough. She had already read it in her mind 100 times across 2 lifetimes, and this version, the real one, the one in her hands, the one with her name in formal typescript above the words junior partner, required less effort to take in than she had expected. It was not a surprise. It was a confirmation. And there is a particular kind of pleasure in confirmations when you have worked for a very long time and with a very clear sightline. A pleasure that is quieter than triumph and more permanent. She folded it into the zippered interior pocket of her briefcase. "Thank you," she said to Elliot. He nodded. He looked at her with the professional warmth of a man extending something he is genuinely glad to extend, and also with the slight, barely perceptible uncertainty of someone who suspects he is not entirely seeing the person in front of him, that there are floors below the floor he is standing on. He had always looked at her this way. She had decided early on that it was the best kind of relationship, one in which she was respected and partially mysterious, and the mystery was not manufactured, but was simply the natural result of the fact that she had more context than he did, more layers, more reasons, and she was not obligated to explain all of them. "Constance would like to take you to dinner," he said. "To celebrate. She suggested La Maison next Thursday." "Tell her yes," Mara said. She left his office and walked back to her desk and sat down. As the afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle she had grown to regard as hers. The 44th floor faced west, and in the afternoon the light came in low and flat and turned the surface of her desk a very particular shade of gold that she had noticed on her first day and had been noticing ever since. She put her hand flat on the desk in the light. She felt the warmth of it. She had things to do. But there was a restructuring matter waiting for her attention. A mid-market logistics company whose directors had made a series of decisions that would require careful forensic untangling before any restructuring plan could be credibly filed. There was a call with Patricia Ewan at 5, the beginning of a conversation about a new opportunity in the commercial property sector that Mara had identified and flagged and believed would become significant. There were emails. There were always emails. She opened the restructuring file and she began to read. At 6:30, after the Patricia Ewan call, she made herself a coffee. The machine required calibration she had now internalized. A specific sequence of steps, a 45-second wait, and she stood at the kitchen counter and drank it, and thought about the last time she had stood in a company kitchen and felt this kind of stillness. She thought it had been the night her first life ended, alone in her apartment. With the light coming in at a low angle from the west, she thought the light was the same, the stillness was the same. The difference was that she was not, this time, standing at an ending. She was standing at the place where the scaffolding was coming down because the structure it had supported was now complete enough to hold itself. She washed her coffee cup and put it back on its hook and turned off the kitchen light. Vivian called her the following week. Vivian had been living in Hong Kong for 2 years and called on occasions that Mara had come to recognize as information-gathering exercises disguised as check-ins. She said, "I heard something through a colleague. Is it true you were involved in the transactions related to Papa's company? She had begun calling Chendue Papa in her early 20s, which was a decision Mara had never commented on. I was counsel for the acquiring party, Mara said. Oh, it was a legitimate transaction under regulatory mandate. You can review the public filings. There was the quality of pause that Vivian produced when encountering information she had not expected and was rapidly reorganizing her framework around. When did you become that kind of lawyer? She said, and there was something in the question that was not entirely hostile. Something that was, possibly, the closest thing to genuine curiosity that Vivian had ever directed at her. Well, I've been this kind of lawyer for a while, Mara said. You never asked. She could hear Vivian breathing. Then Vivian said, Mara, did you do this on purpose? Mara looked at the window. The afternoon light was coming in at a low angle, the good afternoon light she had chosen the apartment specifically for. There was a cup of tea going cold on her desk. There was a stack of files for the next transaction. A restructuring matter, nothing personal, simply good work. Also, there was a partnership letter in the interior pocket of her briefcase, folded along 3 clean lines. Of course not, she said. I was assigned to the transaction by the firm. You can check the records. She paused. I have another call. Take care of yourself. She ended the call and set the phone face down on the desk and picked up the cold tea and drank it, and turned to her files. For a long time she sat there in the quiet of her west-facing apartment, working through the restructuring documents with the even, unhurried concentration of a person who is exactly where they have earned the right to be. The city outside moved through its afternoon. The light shifted. The tea cooled, and she replaced it. The file resolved itself into a structure she could work with, and she made her notes, and she moved to the next item and the one after that. No one had called to pick her up. No one had waited. No one had been informed. And the cream-colored envelope sat in her briefcase. The 2 interlocking H's in deep navy pressed against the dark fabric of the interior. Outside, the city kept its ordinary business, its 10,000 negotiations and arrivals and departures, its traffic and its light and its smell of exhaust and wet concrete, and the ghost of fast food 2 blocks over. She did not think about the sidewalk outside 88 Harlow Tower at 9:47 on a Friday night. She did not think about the car that had not waited. She did not think about the group chat that had gone to everyone except her, the booking confirmation, the curt text, and the reimbursement that had never come. She had nothing to think about. She had already done everything there was to do. She pulled the next file toward her and opened it.